The wind, a mournful sigh across the frozen expanse, sculpted the snow into waves that mimicked an ocean of white. It whispered secrets of cold and desolation, a lament for what lay beneath its chilling embrace. Here, where the skeletal arms of blackened pines clawed at a bruised sky, the silence was profound, broken only by the rustle of that same wind through the brittle branches, a sound like dry bones rattling. This was a land stripped bare, unforgiving. A canvas of winter, vast and indifferent, upon which a single, stark tragedy had been painted in shades of ash and crimson, now mercifully veiled by the fresh fall. What sorrows could such a place hold, and what resilience could possibly bloom in its frozen heart? The snow held the answer, a fragile breath against its icy cheek. She lay half-buried, a ruin amidst the ruins of a life violently extinguished. Her name was Ilara. The crimson on the snow around her was not the blush of dawn, but the stark evidence of brutality, a flower of death blooming in the frost, staining the pristine canvas. Splintered wood, charred remnants of a wagon wheel, a child's forgotten doll with one button eye staring blankly skyward, all fragments of a shattered dream, now entombed. Her breath, a faint mist, a desperate flag against the overwhelming cold, was the only testament that life, however tenuous, still clung to her. One hand, chapped and blue, clutched a small, smooth piece of wood, a crudely carved bird, its form almost lost within her frozen grip. Her eyelids, heavy with a rime of ice, fluttered, a moth's wing against the encroaching darkness, revealing eyes clouded with pain and the fading light of consciousness. She was a fragment, adrift in a sea of white, on the precipice of becoming just another frozen secret held by the earth. Then, a shadow fell. Not the shadow of a passing cloud, nor the lean silhouette of a hungry wolf drawn by the scent of despair. This was taller, more deliberate. Cale moved with the quiet grace of the snow itself, his moccasined feet making no sound on the packed surface. A Modoc warrior, his face a mask carved by hardship and the wisdom of the mountains, eyes dark and deep as winter pools, reflecting the grey sky. He had seen the smoke from a distance, a smudge against the purity of the horizon, days ago. He had tracked the aftermath, not with curiosity, but with a grim understanding that was part of the air he breathed, the land he knew. He knelt. His gaze swept over the frozen tableau, the scattered remnants of wagons, the dark stain seeping into the purity of the snow, the unseeing eyes of the fallen. They had thought her dead, another casualty of the butchery, left for the indifferent elements. He saw the faint cloud of her breath. Life. Stubborn. A flicker in the vast, encroaching night. His own breath hitched, almost imperceptibly, a rare crack in his stoic composure. He weighed the cost, the risk. His solitude was a shield. Yet, to leave even this faint spark to be extinguished felt like a betrayal of some unspoken creed. He reached out, not with the hand that held his bow, but the other, calloused and strong. His fingers, surprisingly gentle, brushed the snow from her cheek. Cold. So cold. Her eyes opened, a slit of terror and confusion. A whisper, lost in the wind. Note Cale said nothing. Words were a currency he spent rarely. His actions would speak. He noted the way her fingers tightened on the wooden bird, a small, desperate anchor. He understood anchors. He saw the faint tremor that ran through her, the body's last protest against the inevitable. He shifted, his movements economical, efficient. He unslung a heavy fur from his own shoulders, a pelt cured against the harshest winters. With a strength that belied his lean frame, he gathered her, a fragile weight, into his arms. The fur enveloped her, a sudden, shocking warmth against her frozen skin. She was too weak to struggle, her consciousness a flickering flame. His presence was overwhelming, a scent of pine smoke, leather, and the wild. Fear warred with an elemental need for the heat he offered. He began to walk, his stride even, tireless, carrying her away from the landscape of her death, towards an unknown horizon. The wind howled at their backs, trying to reclaim her, but Cale walked on, a bulwark against its fury, a silent promise etched in the set of his jaw. The snow continued to fall, softly now, as if trying to erase the memory of what it had witnessed, blanketing the path behind them, leaving only the warrior and his burden, moving through a world bleached of all but survival. What spark remained in her, and could it truly be fanned back to life in such a harsh world, under the care of a man whose eyes held the sorrow of 1,000 winters? The cave was a wound in the mountainside, hidden behind a curtain of ancient junipers whose branches, heavy with snow, drooped to kiss the earth. Inside, it was a haven of dim light and surprising warmth. A small fire Cale coaxed to life in a shallow pit breathed a smoky perfume into the air, its flames casting dancing shadows on the rough stone walls, painting them with fleeting images of comfort. He laid Ilara down gently on a bed of dry pine needles and softer furs, the ones he carried for himself. Her body was a study in agony, even in its stillness. The journey had been a blur of jolting movement, of cold seeping through the fur, and the steady, rhythmic beat of Cale's heart against her back. Now, the relative warmth was a fresh torment, needles pricking at her thawing flesh. Her eyes, when they focused, saw him moving with quiet purpose. He brought snow in a battered pot, melting it near the fire. He examined her frost-bitten fingers and toes with a clinical detachment that was somehow reassuring, his touch firm but not unkind. He had a small leather pouch filled with dried herbs, their scent sharp and medicinal. He crushed them, mixed them with rendered fat, and began to tend to her injuries. Ilara flinched, a small, animal sound escaping her lips. The pain was a live thing, coiling and striking. "Child," she whispered, the word a shard of glass in her throat. Her eyes darted to the wooden bird, still clutched in her hand. "Samuel!" She could almost feel his small hand pressing it into hers, his voice earnest. "So the birds will always sing for you, Mama." Even when it's quiet, the memory brought a fresh wave of anguish. Cale's gaze followed hers, lingering on the small carving for a moment before returning to his task. He said nothing. His silence was a vast, empty space, and into it, Ilara's terror and grief poured. Memories, fragmented and sharp, assaulted her. The laughter of her son, his small hand in hers as they walked beside the wagon. The smell of wood smoke from their campfire. The sudden, terrifying shouts. The glint of steel in the fading light. The screams. Samuel's face, wide-eyed, looking up at her. She gasped, a raw, tearing sound. Tears, hot and immediate, tracked pathways through the grime on her cheeks. Cale paused, his hand still. He did not look at her, but she felt his stillness, an acknowledgement of her pain that was more profound than any platitude. He offered her water, warm now, in a carved wooden cup. She drank, her throat raw, the liquid a small comfort. Days blurred into a rhythm of pain, fitful sleep, and Cale's quiet ministrations. He would leave for hours, his departure as silent as his return, always bringing something essential, firewood, water, or sometimes, a snared rabbit. He cooked the meat, offering her the choicest pieces. She ate little, her stomach recoiling. Once, seeing him prepare a poultice, she tried to reach for a nearby herb bundle, to help, to show she was not entirely useless, but her hand trembled too violently, and the bundle slipped from her weak fingers. Cale merely picked it up, his expression unchanging, continuing his work as if she hadn't moved. His self-sufficiency was a wall, impenetrable. The wooden bird was her only constant, a tangible link to a world that had ceased to exist. She would turn it over and over in her fingers, feeling the smooth, worn wood, remembering Samuel's pride. The silence in the cave was broken only by the crackle of the fire, the drip of melting icicles outside, and Ilara's occasional, involuntary moans. She watched Cale. He seemed a part of the cave itself, of the mountain, his movements mirroring the patient, relentless forces of nature. She saw how he listened to the wind before venturing out, how his eyes scanned the patterns of frost on the stone. He was a creature of the wilderness, as much a part of it as the wind and the stone. His movements were economical, precise. He wasted nothing. He spoke only when essential, single words. Eat, drink, stay. She wondered about him. Who was he? Why had he saved her? Was he truly alone? There were no signs of others. His eyes, when they met hers, were unreadable, yet she sometimes caught a flicker of something in their depths, a shared understanding of loss, perhaps, or merely the stoic acceptance of a harsh world. One evening, As the firelight painted the cave walls in hues of orange and red, she found her voice, raspy and weak. "Why?" He was sharpening a knife, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel a hypnotic sound. He did not stop. He did not look up. After a long moment, he answered, his voice low, like the rumble of distant thunder. "Live, just that. Live." It was not a question, nor an entreaty. It was a statement. A truth. Or perhaps, a command. Ilara closed her eyes. Live. The word echoed in the hollows of her grief. Was it possible? Could she? The image of Samuel's face swam before her. For him, perhaps. To carry his memory, to ensure the song of his little wooden bird was not entirely silenced. The path ahead was shrouded in darkness, but in Cale's stark command, a tiny, almost imperceptible spark had been struck. The cold was still there, deep in her bones, but now, it felt a fraction less absolute. The thaw within Ilara was as slow and arduous as the retreat of winter from the high peaks. Days stretched into weeks. The raw edges of her frostbite began to heal, turning from angry red to a tender pink, tended with Cale's poultices. The gnawing ache in her limbs lessened. She began to eat more, the simple, smoky flavor of roasted meat no longer tasting of ash and despair, but of sustenance, of life asserting itself. Cale, a silent tutor, began to draw her into the rhythm of his existence. He would leave a small pile of kindling and a flint and steel near her, his unspoken expectation clear. Her first attempts to spark a flame were clumsy, frustrating. Her hands, still stiff and sore, fumbled. He watched, offering no help, his patience a vast, unwavering landscape. When at last a tiny spark caught, igniting a wisp of dry grass, a tremor of accomplishment, small but significant, ran through her. He nodded once, a minimalist acknowledgement that nonetheless felt like high praise. He showed her how to identify edible roots, their bitter taste a surprise, dug from beneath the thinning snow with a sharpened stick. He taught her to set simple snares along rabbit trails, patiently demonstrating the knot, the placement, the careful camouflaging with leaves and twigs. Her first few attempts yielded nothing but frustration. The snares were empty or sprung by the wind. Then, one morning, she found a small rabbit, still and silent, in one of her traps. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over her, sorrow for the creature's life, but also a grim satisfaction, a sense of providing. Cale merely grunted his approval when he saw it, a sound more expressive than many men's words. He showed her how to skin and prepare it, his movements efficient, respectful of the animal. She learned to stitch torn leather with an awl and sinew, her fingers slowly regaining their dexterity. She mended one of his spare moccasins, the task absorbing her, the repetitive motion a strange comfort. He accepted it without comment, but the next day, he wore them. These were their conversations, conducted in the language of shared tasks and quiet observation. Her fear of him had long since faded, replaced by a complex tapestry of gratitude, dependence, and a burgeoning understanding. She saw the old scars that mapped his body, faint white lines against his weathered skin, stories untold, battles fought, losses endured. She understood, in a way that needed no words, that he too was a survivor, a solitary sentinel in a world that had taken much from him. His solitude, she realized, was not emptiness, but a deep, resonant connection to the wild, a communion. One day, a blizzard swept down from the north, a screaming white fury that imprisoned them in the cave for 3 days. The wind howled like a demon, rattling the juniper branches, threatening to tear their fragile shelter apart. The fire became their anchor, their sun. They huddled near its warmth, the silence between them no longer strained, but companionable. Cale carved, his knife moving with deft precision over a piece of cedar, chips falling like snow onto the cave floor. He was shaping an animal, perhaps a wolf, its form emerging slowly from the wood. Ilara watched him, the rhythmic motion soothing. She held Samuel's bird, its smooth surface a familiar comfort. He loved birds, she found herself saying, the words quiet, tentative. Cale's knife stilled. He did not look at her, but his attention was absolute. He wanted to fly like them. Free, a single tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. Cale resumed his carving, the silence returning, but it felt different now, softer, as if her small confession had woven a new thread into its fabric. As the storm raged outside, their shared vulnerability forged a bond stronger than any spoken promise. He was her protector, her guide, but she was beginning to understand that survival was not a passive state. It required participation. It demanded will. The first time she ventured out of the cave alone, Cale was away, hunting. A pale sun glinted on the fresh snow. The air was sharp, clean. She walked a short distance, her legs still a little unsteady, but gaining strength. She gathered fallen branches for the fire, her movements becoming more assured. She saw a rabbit, frozen in place, watching her. For a moment, their eyes met. Then it was gone, a flash of brown against the white. She returned to the cave, her arms full, a quiet sense of purpose warming her. Cale found her tending the fire, the flames burning brightly. He paused at the entrance, his dark eyes taking in the scene. He said nothing, but a subtle shift in his expression, a fractional softening around his mouth, spoke volumes. The landscape of her grief remained, vast and shadowed, but tiny patches of green were beginning to appear. Life, persistent and tenacious, was finding root. Yet, even as this fragile piece began to settle, a new unease stirred. One evening, Cale returned later than usual, his face grimmer than she had ever seen it. He carried no game. He sat by the fire, staring into the flames, his silence heavy, watchful. "Riders," he said at last, his voice a low rasp. 3. South. Ilara's heart leaped into her throat. The word hung in the air, cold and sharp as an icicle. Pursuers. The faceless threat she had almost allowed herself to forget. They had not given up. The fragile sanctuary of their hidden valley felt suddenly exposed, vulnerable. The world, which had begun to feel like a place of potential healing, once again showed its teeth. The air in the cave grew taut, stretched thin with unspoken dread. Cale's pronouncement, "Riders." 3. South, echoed in the confined space, a death knell to the fragile peace Ilara had begun to cultivate. The rhythmic scrape of his knife sharpening a stone arrowhead was the only sound, each stroke a measure of the encroaching peril. He worked with a focused intensity, his movement stripped of all but grim purpose. Ilara watched him, her own breath shallow, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The memory of the massacre, the screams, the metallic scent of blood, rose like bile in her throat. These riders, she knew with a chilling certainty, were not chance travelers. They were the loose ends, the lingering shadow of that horror. They hunted her. For what? To silence the last witness? Or did they believe she carried something of value from the ruined wagons, some phantom treasure conjured by their own greed? It didn't matter. Their intent was singular, erasure. Cale glanced at her. His eyes, usually so unreadable, held a flicker of something akin to a question. Not of her fear, but of her readiness. He had taught her much in their silent weeks together. How to move without sound. How to read the wind. How to draw strength from the unyielding earth. But he had not taught her how to face men whose hearts were as cold as the winter stone. That, she would have to find within herself. "They will find this place?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, yet firmer than she expected. Cale nodded slowly. "Smoke. Tracks." Soon he gestured to the narrow entrance of the cave. One way in, his meaning was clear. This was defensible, but it was also a trap. He rose, his silhouette stark against the dying embers of the fire. He began to prepare, not for flight, but for a stand. He checked his bow, the string taut and strong. He laid out his arrows, each one tipped with a point of razor-sharp obsidian or stone. He secured a long knife to his belt. He was a warrior preparing for battle, a primal force aligning himself with the ancient guardians of this land. Ilara felt a cold dread seep into her bones, but beneath it, something else stirred. A spark of defiance. She was no longer the broken, helpless creature he had found in the snow. She had tasted survival. She had learned the language of the wild. She would not be a passive victim again. She thought of Samuel, of his bright, courageous spirit. She thought of the little wooden bird, still clutched in her pocket, a reminder of love and loss, but also of resilience. She looked at Cale, his face set in grim lines, a lone protector against a tide of malice. And she knew she could not let him face this alone. "I can help," she said, her voice clearer now, imbued with a resolve that surprised even herself. Cale paused, turning to her. He studied her face for a long moment, his gaze intense, searching. Then, he gave a curt nod. He handed her a small, sharp skinning knife. Not a weapon for fighting men, perhaps, but it was something. A tool. A symbol of her choice. He pointed to a narrow fissure high in the cave wall, barely wide enough for a body to squeeze through. If. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. It was an escape route. For her. His unspoken instruction, he would hold them, she would live. The irony was not lost on her. He, who had breathed life back into her, was now offering her a path away from the very fight his presence had drawn. But she shook her head. No, her voice was quiet but firm. "We stay." A flicker of surprise, perhaps even respect, crossed Cale's stoic features. He held her gaze for another heartbeat, then turned back to his preparations. The decision was made. They would face what was coming, together. The waiting was the hardest part. The silence of the pre-dawn hours, broken only by the drip of water, the distant hoot of an owl, and the frantic beating of Ilara's own heart. She found a heavy piece of firewood, its weight reassuring in her hand. It was not much, but it was hers to wield. Her mind raced, a torrent of fear and desperate hope. Could they truly survive this? Could she? Then she remembered Cale's unwavering gaze, the subtle way he had included her in their survival. He believed she had this strength, or he would not have allowed her to stay. As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the juniper screen, they heard it. The crunch of snow under hooves. The low murmur of voices. They were here. Cale flattened himself against the rock wall beside the entrance, bow drawn, an arrow narked. He was utterly still, a part of the stone itself. Just before the first shadow fell across the entrance, he shot a quick glance at Ilara, a minute inclination of his head towards a shadowed alcove near her. "Stay low. Wait." The instruction was clear, unspoken. Ilara crouched further back in the shadows, her makeshift club held tight, the skinning knife tucked into her belt. Her fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but her resolve was a fire in her veins. 3 figures appeared at the cave mouth, silhouetted against the grey light. Rough men, their faces hard, eyes scanning the interior. "Anyone here?" one called out, his voice coarse, impatient. Silence answered. He motioned to the others. "Check it." She couldn't have gotten far. One of them, bolder or more foolish than the rest, stepped inside. In that instant, Cale moved. The bowstring twanged, a sharp, deadly sound. The man cried out, a choked gasp, and fell, an arrow protruding from his chest. The other 2 recoiled, shouting curses, drawing their pistols. Gunfire erupted, the shots deafening in the enclosed space, bullets ricocheting off the stone walls with angry whines. Cale loosed another arrow, finding its mark in the shoulder of the second man, who staggered back, screaming. The third man, seeing his companions fall, hesitated, then charged into the cave, pistol blazing. Cale dropped his bow, drawing his long knife, meeting the charge with a guttural cry. Steel rang on steel. Ilara saw her chance. As the 2 men grappled, their bodies locked in a desperate struggle, she surged forward, the heavy piece of firewood raised high. She brought it down with all her strength on the attacker's exposed arm, the one holding the pistol. A sickening crack, and the gun clattered to the cave floor. The man roared in pain and fury, turning towards her, his face contorted. Before he could strike, Cale's knife found its opening. A swift, brutal thrust. The man crumpled, a look of shocked surprise on his face, before falling still. Silence descended, abrupt and absolute, broken only by Cale's harsh breathing and the drip, drip, drip of blood onto the stone. It was over. Ilara stood trembling, the piece of wood falling from her nerveless fingers. She had faced death, and she had fought. She had not hidden. She had stayed. The silence in the aftermath was heavier than any sound, thick with the metallic tang of blood and the chilling finality of death. Cale stood over the fallen men, his chest heaving, his knife still dripping. He was a figure of primal fury, slowly receding, like a storm passing. Ilara leaned against the cold stone wall, her legs threatening to buckle. The adrenaline that had surged through her moments before now ebbed away, leaving her shaken and hollow. A sharp pain shot through her forearm where a piece of flying debris, or perhaps a glancing blow she hadn't registered, had grazed her. The bodies lay still, stark reminders of the violence that had shattered their sanctuary. Cale moved first. He checked each man, his movements economical, grim. Assured they posed no further threat, he straightened. He looked at Ilara, his dark eyes holding hers for a long, unreadable moment. There was no judgment in his gaze, no accusation, only a deep, quiet understanding. He had seen her fear, and he had seen her courage. He had seen her choose to stand, not behind him, but with him. He then noticed the blood welling on her arm. Without a word, he came to her, gently taking her arm, his touch surprisingly tender. He examined the shallow cut, then took a strip of clean cloth from his pouch and bound it firmly. His fingers were deft, sure. This small act of care, amidst the carnage, spoke volumes. He turned away, retrieving his bow. He picked up the spent arrows, wiping them clean before returning them to his quiver. Actions, always actions. They spoke his language more clearly than words ever could. Ilara pushed herself away from the wall, the brief contact a reassurance. Her hands were trembling, but she forced them steady. There was work to be done. The dead could not remain here. Together, in a grim, unspoken partnership, they dragged the bodies out of the cave, away from their shelter, leaving them to the wild and the coming snows. It was a hard, brutal task, stripping away the last vestiges of Ilara's former self, the woman who had flinched from the sight of a butchered rabbit. Now, she handled death with a grim necessity, her focus on the task at hand, her newly bandaged arm a dull ache. The sun was higher now, casting a pale, watery light over the snow-covered landscape. The air felt cleaner out here, away from the immediate scent of the conflict. When it was done, they returned to the cave. The signs of the struggle were stark, the scattered ashes of the fire, the glint of the fallen pistol, the dark stains already seeping into the packed earth floor. Cale began to methodically erase the evidence, covering the bloodstains with fresh earth, writing a fallen waterskin. Ilara knelt and began to rebuild the fire, her hands moving with a newfound surety. The simple act of coaxing flames from tinder and kindling was grounding, a return to the rhythms of life, a conscious act of reclaiming their space from the violence. She was not merely surviving now, she was actively participating in the creation of safety, of warmth. The fire caught, its small flames a fragile defiance against the darkness they had faced. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and their own breathing. The immediate threat was gone, but the world outside remained a dangerous place. Yet, something fundamental had shifted between them. The shared crucible of combat had forged a new kind of bond, unspoken but unbreakable. He was no longer just her rescuer, nor she just his dependent. They were allies, survivors who had chosen to face the darkness together. Cale reached into a pouch at his belt and drew out the small wooden wolf he had been carving during the blizzard. He had finished it. Its lines were clean, powerful, its tiny wooden eyes seeming to hold an ancient wisdom. He held it out to Ilara. She looked at him, questioning. "For you," he said, his voice low. For courage, Ilara's throat tightened. She took the small carving, its wood smooth and cool in her palm. It was a gift, a recognition. She reached into her own pocket and drew out Samuel's bird. She held it beside the wolf. Two small carvings, symbols of what was lost, and what had been found. Hope and resilience, side by side. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He inclined his head, a bare acknowledgement. The future was uncertain. They could not stay in this cave forever. The world was wide, and danger still lurked. But Ilara was no longer afraid. She had faced her ghosts, and she had found an unexpected strength within herself, and an equally unexpected companion in the stoic warrior who had saved her life. The silence that settled between them now was not one of emptiness, but of shared understanding, of a quiet peace earned at great cost. The fire burned brightly, a beacon in their small corner of the wilderness. They had survived. They would continue to survive. Together. The path ahead might be fraught with peril, the winters long and the shadows deep. But in the heart of that vast, indifferent landscape, two solitary souls had found not just refuge, but a reason to keep breathing, to keep fighting, to keep living. What becomes of a spirit when it is pushed to the very edge of oblivion only to be pulled back by an unexpected hand? Does it merely endure, or can it find a new song in the silence, a new strength in the ashes of its past? The wild places of the world, and of the human heart, hold these questions, and sometimes they offer answers in the most unexpected of alliances. What would you have done in Ilara's place, faced with such loss and then such a stark choice? What does it take to truly find the will to live again, and to fight for that life? Tell us below. Share your thoughts in the comments.